Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Ian Povey, who currently runs payments technology and services for NatWest Group. Alongside this, Ian sits on the global board of Swift. He's on the CIO forum for Pay UK, and he's on the advisory board for the Payments Association. So, look, the first question I wanted to ask you today is, in terms of your own character traits, what do you think has made you the successful leader that you are now?
Firstly, thank you. But in reality, it's really down to a journey of time. And I guess leadership comes from your own background as well. So a lot of my things that I sort of lean on are around being authentic, being credible around the subject matter that I'm leading on, and also being informed, so that when you're actually in a discussion with either the team or other individuals, that you can be quite articulate about what you're talking about, but also ask the challenging questions and be curious on the topic that you're involved in at the time. And that really comes back to the grassroots of my background, being in farming, and really having to be quite inventive and curious about how you can solve a lot of problems. And so it really just flows from your background and how you can build on that and always grow over time.
Fair enough. So it's that kind of flexibility and approach to a certain extent.
Adaptability. Yeah, I mean, every scenario is going to be different. I mean, I've worked in so many countries and so many languages, and you're always adapting. So if you look at the work context, whether it be in banking, retail, government, again, you've always got to consider your audience, consider your own position in those sectors and or organizations, and adapt, adjust even to the context. And I think that's part of what we miss a lot in management, let alone leadership, is understanding the context.
Yes. And I think that comes down to kind of storytelling to some extent, right? To be able to provide that context and then set an agenda behind it and around it.
I had the privilege a few years back to do an offsite where we had Harvard professors come, and we stayed in a hotel for about 8 days. And one key professor was Barbara Kellerman, and she was there to talk about followership. So sort of like the other side of leadership, and recognizing that you're wanting to bring people with you on the various journeys. And, how do you encourage that followership, and how do you get them to buy into your vision or the vision of the group that you're working for, and you're having to translate that into their context in their day-to-day roles, be that at the junior levels or at a direct report or even in my own personal remit. So it's always, again, back to the context of really looking at how you can be in the mind of the people you're leading, but also people you're following as well.
And just curious, how much of your time kind of generally, week in, week out, do you spend thinking about and articulating stories to your team and your organization now?
I think in today's context, I'll probably argue that, do I really think about it consciously, or is it in the subconscious? So it's my natural style is to storytell and to use analogies and so on to, again, bring things down to a real level, as opposed to using too much corporate language or vernacular that is just lost on, day-to-day activities. And part of that storytelling is being able to relate to experiences in your own real life, whether that be as a customer of the institution you're working for, or in the sector. So, for example, with transportation and transport ticketing, the Oyster card, we're having to totally transform the London model and the way we all travelled, and then you evolve that forward into contactless debit cards and credit cards, and that became so much easier because we took for granted waving a piece of plastic at a gate. So you're always not only looking at the team that you're leading to actually deliver an outcome, but you're also thinking about how does this stage of a journey actually enable the next stage and then the one after that. And you don't always know what the next one is.
Of course.
But it's having that consideration of, the opportunities that you're opening as you can.
You make it sound so easy.
It's not.
No.
and I think that's part of, but whether it be Kellerman's view on followership or, leadership in its own right, is you've got to start with the team culture. And that's the biggest challenge. But again, if you can engage with the grassroots of the team, particularly when you're new to the organization, one of the first things I always do is do a one-to-many conversations minus any direct reports so that I can actually get that uncensored view of life on the ground floor as such. And also being able to articulate to them, particularly with payments background, that I actually know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, because that's what I've been doing for 30 years. Of course. And that credibility and authenticity allows you to really just challenge, well, why do you do it that way? Have you considered doing it in this particular way? When you look at being a change organization, if you're changing something, then clearly it's already in a run state. So are you impacting people by making change, by not having consideration, be it on operations teams, be it on the customer, or the industry itself? So you remind people why they're in their roles, but also in the bigger context that their role is actually supporting.
It's such an interesting one for me personally, because I see it in my own organization where, we try to kind of build a culture around storytelling, talking about purpose first and then driving around purpose. And I often find that you talk about that, people buy into that idea, and then they go away and try to implement. And what they implement is a bunch of very specific activity targets. Is it a case, in your experience, is it a case that people either have that ability to naturally tell stories, or is it something that people learn and develop as they...
I think people can learn it because, and it may start as simple as just using analogies as a way of making a point. Because if you get too directive in the ask, then what you just highlighted is going to be the outcome. And people, you lose that free thought that can actually pick up your request and or idea and actually make it better. Because ideally, the people who are working for us will take an idea and actually make it better. That's the whole point. And we should be just guiding them within, this is the direction we'd like you to get to. How you get there is up to you within reason. And again, that's about ensuring that you've got that balance of you're accountable for this, you're empowered to support it, then you can be successful. But you've always got to be there to catch them and willing to catch them should they err towards failure or whatever. Because failure is good, so long as you catch it fast.
Yes. Yeah. And obviously we've talked in the past about your concept of success equals empowerment plus accountability. And I kind of looked at that equation when you first said it to me and thought, but also that could equal failure, right? If you empower people too early and you give them too much accountability without them having the capability sitting underneath, then sometimes it can deliver the wrong outcomes, I guess.
Totally agree. And I think that comes back to understanding the context of the roles that the individuals that you're talking about in that situation, or how close you remain to the outcome as well, and the gates and so on. Because quite often you'll see in large corporations where a program of work might take 4 years and the goal is on that 4-year date, not the steps in between. And the world will evolve over that time. And if you don't have those gates and those check-ins, then you're waiting for 4 years before you found out whether you failed or succeeded. Again, you've got to have that preparedness to always be engaged, not micromanaging by any stretch. That's the last thing. Because if you don't empower them, then people don't get the satisfaction, and nor do they get the opportunity to grow. Because curiosity comes from that empowerment. Because sometimes you've got to make them fend for themselves a little bit.
Yeah. And
back to the farming analogy, I always link it back to MacGyver, because great TV show for those old enough for us. I remember that show, but the point is, when you're miles away from the homestead, and you've got to innovate with what's around you. And you've got to be curious, can I make this work to get me home, or, to save my life, in the case of whatever the situation may be. So, and that translates into the corporate environment as well, minus the snacks and dangerous things.
No, I can absolutely see that. So just going back to your kind of storytelling, natural skill set around storytelling, do you have a preferred kind of method that you use?
Oh, really, it's always, depends on the moment. A lot of it can be spur of. So back to the analogy point, I will throw a lot of analogies out there just to sort of make a point.
Right.
Try to consciously avoid, and I usually successfully do, corporate language, as I said earlier. Not that I'm against corporate language, it just makes things feel less authentic when you use it too much. So you've got to get that balance. I think if I look at if I'm preparing for a big speech or, a panel or something, I will look for a contextual story for that and sort of plan it a bit more. But normally it's just free flow.
Right.
And again, that comes from experience.
Yeah. Yes, free flow with lots of planning, or free flow and following your nose a little bit,
following
facing
your nose a
experience.
little bit, because again, part of growing your leadership skills and also your career is maintaining a level of diversity of inputs. And my diversity of inputs is everything from multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple industry sectors, and that is a powerful set of vectors to sort of leverage in different contexts. The great thing about, because I've specialized in payments for so long, but I am still agnostic of any industry sector because payments covers all industry sectors. And again, your storytelling can be in context of that, whether it be in a government situation, bank, retail, etc.
I'd be keen to touch on that for a moment as well, because obviously it feels like it's a kind of natural fit for you. Obviously, at this point in your career, you're Mr. Payments, right? Very well known in the industry, very very engaged within the industry. At some point, I guess you must have chosen this as a career path. Were you playing a few moves ahead at that point, knowing that this was going to be central and cuts across various industries, and even in your current role, cuts across various areas of the organisation?
Sort of, and the reason I say that is, if I go back to the beginning, part of what triggered this journey was really analysing different roles and going, okay, and I've always been quite goal-centred, certainly in my earlier life, and that focus was, well, what are the sectors that are pervasive? And therefore, that you've got an opportunity, because some roles can be very narrow in their breadth. And part of that was saying, well, if there's a downturn in financial services, there may be an uptick in government opportunities or other sectors. So it's that sort of balance. But the other part was, I started by focusing on chips and chip technology, which we all take for granted in our cell phones and on our debit and credit cards. That was the beginning of this whole 30-year journey. And when you look at where chips have evolved over that time, you can see how your journey can also follow different vectors, because the Oyster card is a case in point, the mobile phone industry, as I just noted, national ID cards in the case of Malaysia and many others around the world. So again, I wouldn't say there was any accident in the path. It was very much a chosen point to specialize.
Right.
And I just found that specialization worked for me.
It's interesting. Because you make it sound so simple, right? But I put that into my own context and think, if I ever sat back at any point in my career and thought further than kind of until now, where I'm thinking about it from a business context and saying, okay, for my own business, what's our 5-year plan? And that's fairly clear. But even at that point, it's still a little bit beyond 3 years. It becomes a little bit less clear, right? But doing it from a personal perspective, I think that's probably a bit more unique.
Yes, but I think the other side of it is, and if I go back and you look at chip and pin as an example, there was a real activity even in Indonesia and places back in the 90s. We saw the UK really push with chip and pin in 2005. But it doesn't, the whole world needs to align. That's where you look at different technologies, different standards. Many of them are globally dependent. So therefore, you look at the opportunities that we've only covered off the UK. We've still got North America and South and Latin America and so on. So you can see that path of opportunity to continue to expand and become that specialist.
Yeah.
So when I was here in 2005, my next focus was actually Canada.
Right.
So it was being able to use what you learned in one country and apply it in the next.
Yeah.
What you learn in one company, apply it in the next.
Yeah. So for you, it's always been develop the skill, find the opportunity, rather than find the opportunity, develop the skill.
Develop and reuse,
right,
and evolve.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. It seems like a logical way to approach it, right? But I guess there are several ways to skin the cat. But okay, cool. And just going back to your own kind of personal traits for a second, I think again one of the things that we talked about when preparing for this conversation was your kind of photographic memory and how that's come into its own throughout your career. So I guess at what point did you recognise that you had that kind of sharp photographic memory?
Well, that goes right back, thankfully, to my high school and university days, so it was quite useful back then. But it's equally useful now, and I mean, even some of my direct reports will go, if you need to be on guard, because I'll remember something from 12 months ago, and I do if it's important to remember it. Yes, it's a bit of a skill. I definitely exploit it. not everybody can naturally take that on board as well, but you can train your mind to do it. It's just part of the tool chest for me,
Of course.
in that context. So, but it's really, particularly when you're looking and governing a large community of accountability, you're not always going to be thinking about, well, okay, this little project we did on checks versus big project we're doing on cross-border payments. You've still got to have some sort of informed ability to, talk to an individual who's still working on the checks team and doesn't feel isolated because your focus is over on here on cross-border. So it's that, remembering what you're accountable for in my case, but also remember you got 500,000-600,000 people working for you, and you've got to be able to relate to them, because otherwise you lose that followership that I mentioned at the beginning.
Yes, I completely see that. I think, the purpose of these conversations from my perspective is to really shine a light on leaders and their skill set and their capabilities, so others can hopefully leverage off right, and help themselves in their own career. And I think actually talking about things like having a photographic memory, that's clearly a skill that some people cannot develop, however much training they do. Would you agree with that? Or
I would. Again, I've not had to overthink it, I guess, but it is one of those skills that either you do have to invest a lot to maintain that memory recall, and people live busy lives. It's not something that they focus on.
True. Yeah, that's very true. I suppose in today's world where you're going back to back to back, constantly context switching, it's even more difficult, right? To really, I suppose part of it comes down to prep for conversations as well, does it?
Mostly, particularly if you're doing more senior meetings and preparing that message that you need to land, or the ask that you're wanting to land as well in particular. And if you've only got a very short period of time, like 5 minutes, to land a pretty critical point. But that in itself is something that you and I have to continue to work on, which is really saying, how do you simplify the story, the narrative? Because a lot of the remits that leaders have are quite complex subjects. Payments is complex in its own right, but think of somebody in taxation or in law and so on.
Of course.
How do they really simplify that message to a totally different audience who isn't specialised in their sector or space, but need to understand, and either from an investment ask or a sign-off for regulatory compliance, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work that's needed in that as well, to not dumb down, but certainly to put into plain English some of the stuff we take for granted as specialists and as leaders.
And your messages, do you find that they tend to land intra-conversation, or is it a case, when generally you're delivering big messages, is it a case that you kind of set the headline and then after that there's a significant amount of work to then actually build the message?
It really does depend on the situation. I would argue in the main it is about getting that headline out. And I've used that technique a bit of saying, okay, if you were to write tomorrow's newspaper, what would be on the front page?
Right.
It's sort of a way to try and get people to narrow it down and focus. And then if you want to read the editorial, then that's up to you. And again, it's circumstantial, but you've really got to, everything should be short enough at a senior level, because you've got so much content that you're having to manage. And if you don't have that time to yourself, let alone for others to be able to keep up with you, then you're going to lose people.
Yes, it resonates completely. And I think if you put it into the context of your own organisation, there's probably a fairly large percentage of those people that probably wouldn't read the editorial, right? Would only ever read the headline. And actually, I read a recent interview of yours where you talk about the 6 vectors of the transformation that you're working on right now within NatWest. And I guess that is about creating those really purpose-driven headlines that people can get behind, right?
And communicating that there's tension in those vectors as well, whether you're looking at cost versus revenue or you're looking at competition and regulation, those types of points, everything has that tension. So you've got to always bring out, okay, what's that balance? How do we actually ensure that we're not all leaning towards a compliance agenda versus actually what about a customer and a growth agenda? And that takes interpretation. You need to draw in other people's informed position, be it legal, be it risk, etc. But there's so much around well, I've tried to move away from the word transformation, which I know the article you're referencing I did use. But the reason for that is modernisation resonates a lot more as a word than the word transformation does. Transformation can be scary, whereas modernisation, you understand it by the very nature of the word itself. And so once you start to continue to evolve, as I have done on that particular point, it does make the next step so much easier as well. Because, big topics at the moment are around modernisation, but it's also about how do you allow that to drive innovation. Now, the byproduct of all of that can be transformation, because it's easier to articulate it in the former rather than the latter.
I 100% see that. I think I had an interesting situation myself recently where I was using the word change quite a lot in the context of small organisational changes. As we scale as an organisation, clearly people's roles and responsibilities are constantly changing and evolving. And I found myself talking about change. And one of my colleagues pulled me to one side and said, you have to stop saying change, use the word evolution or progression. And actually, since doing that, you recognise the impact that it has in the conversations is very different. People are much more enthusiastic and excited about it.
And that's a critical point, because change is a scary word for junior staff members, because the first thing they're going to default to is, oh, does that mean I have a job tomorrow? Or
Yes.
You're going to ask me to do more work than I'm already doing and I'm already stressed.
Yeah.
So, it is, again, that's part of where the storytelling comes back into it. And that's not storytelling to distract. It's actually to reinforce why you're doing this.
Yeah.
One of the things I've always done, both in my current role and my past roles, is very early on ensure that it's very clear to the entire team where we're trying to get to. And whilst it might be, I use the analogy of a flagpole on a hill, so you at least see the flagpole. What you can't see is how many valleys between here and that hill.
Yeah.
And so your path to get there is going to evolve over time. And again, that requires you to always be flexible and to consider, again, the context of each valley as you go along that journey.
Of course.
And we've hit one of the biggest ones since my time in that West, which with COVID.
Yeah.
That totally changed the way we work, the strategy in some pockets, timing of the strategy being an outcome because of either moving out dates from a regulatory standpoint, etc. You've got to flex with those unplanned events and uncontrolled events.
Of course.
And that requires its own skill set as well.
And so when COVID hit, so I guess it'd be good to dig into that a little bit from a leadership perspective. So how did you find your own style and how you were delivering messages and how you were doing your job? How did that change and evolve over the COVID period?
I think one of the advantages when I moved over here and took on this role is we were already using Zoom before COVID because of the geographic spread of the team. So that, I guess, moving to that 100% became less of a challenge, if you like, because people were comfortable with the tool. From my own role perspective, it was very much about maintaining visibility. So, before COVID, it was always being able to rotate around the offices in the UK and India. It was rotating around the Zooms as well, because the danger with 100% Zoom was everything was just extremely transactional. So you missed seeing a lot of your team, because even in the physical world, you don't always engage everybody on a transactional level. You have your town halls, you have one-to-many meetings and so on. So it's better of very rapidly finding a way to plug that gap and maintain that visibility to the people that you don't transact with on a daily or every other day basis. And that's, for me, is still one of the challenges even now, is that transactional nature of Teams and Zoom and the like. Because by the time you look at filling up your diary, you've just got a whole heap of transactions going on a day-to-day basis, between 8 and maybe 15 transactions in a day. So you've got to create that space. And part of what we did was actually use play on words with Work Well Wednesday that said, thou shalt not send a meeting invite on a Wednesday to another team member in my organisation, so that everybody can actually have a day where they can actually do the work without attending meetings.
Yeah.
And that's worked for some, hasn't worked for everybody, or it worked for a period of time and sort of gravitated over. Requires a discipline to hold on to it. But again, it's just thinking beyond the subject matter and always being conscious that outcomes are reliant on people.
Sure.
And those people need to be always with you. Individually, they won't always be. Your own consciousness of, do you believe in your own narrative? You've got to check occasionally as well. So again, that's just showing a bit more vulnerability, but it's more about being real.
Yeah, I get that completely. I think it's a really difficult thing to do, to be that disciplined, and when you're trying to implement something that is so, for want of a better word, for transformational like that, where you're saying, actually, right, we've got into this habit of your diaries are getting filled up day in, day out, and now we're saying this day, you've got to keep that clear. I guess actually implementing that idea, it's either going to go one of two ways, I suppose. Either people are going to grab hold of it and say, I need this, or they're going to be really reluctant and probably not take it up, and then it loses impact and starts to get watered down through the organization, right? How do you deal with that situation?
And that's something you got to be jumping on very, very quickly.
Right.
So that's about, grabbing the cohort of people and ideally a blend so that people who are a bit more on the naysay side can hear from the positive side as well. So you get a cross-fertilization of people's reactions, if you like. Because if you just had a group of people who are, anti the agenda, then you've got no positivity in that discussion, and you're really up against it in a one-to-many situation. But if you have super users or people who are on board, then you're actually who are at the same level as well. They're not saying, "Oh, here's the leader dictating terms," as opposed to here's a peer who actually sees the benefit of this.
Yeah,
and it's a bit like how you balance your workloads. I remind people, and again, using analogies, it's like, well, if you're going to go and take 3 weeks annual leave to go to a holiday resort, you're not logged on work on the holiday resort. You shouldn't be.
Yeah. So
the point being is you can take 3 weeks and the team isn't going to fall apart, and more importantly, being able to say, okay, I could step away from my day-to-day work for 3 weeks and go on training course, or actually do a special project on the side and actually help solve a problem. Again, it's just saying, well, I've proven it through annual leave. I can actually do it in day-to-day as well.
Yeah.
And it's just thinking a little differently in each of those situations.
It's trust a lot of it, I suppose.
A lot.
Yes. And it takes time to build that trust, right? And I guess you have to go through scenarios where you test it, it doesn't quite work, you need to go back, make it a little bit better, test it again.
And that's where, again, back to the whole readiness and willingness to be flexible, is understanding the team and the skills and the background. I mean, you're not, their roles, certainly at the junior levels, are a microcosm of the leader's role, but it's the collective that actually brings it all together. So, the trust, the amount that you're having to trust sort of condenses based on the individual and their remit. So an architect's remit is very different to somebody doing the engineering, let alone the analysts or the testers. So in all of that situation, for me, it's, if you don't trust people, then why did we hire them in the first place?
Yeah.
And why were they attracted if they didn't trust me or their line manager as well? Trust is bidirectional. So you've got to remember that is a core component of human interaction, frankly.
Right.
And not lose sight of that in the corporate sense.
What happens when it doesn't quite work?
Yes.
When there's a bit of a delta between your expectations and actually what materializes in reality.
Yeah. And that's where leadership really kicks in the context of being prepared to have the challenging conversations or to deal with the challenging situation. Because all too often there's plenty of case studies around the world of people who have just ignored the problem, and then it festers, and then, of course, anarchy breaks loose. So you do have to try and nip these situations in the bud as quickly as possible. And actually, quite often, the individual or individuals in question may actually have a better idea, and they're just not being heard by their line manager or their skip levels above that. So sometimes it's just a case of listen, and then look at the context of the situation, either for the line manager of that area or my own team. So listening is always going to be part of it. Doesn't mean that they're going to be right. Doesn't mean you're going to be right. And a recent piece of work we've been doing through an external party came up and used the term hippo, and I thought, well, this is an interesting anagram, if you like. And basically, it represents the highest earner in the room opinion,
right?
So the highest income person, and the view being that the hippo will override anything else that's happened in the meeting. But that's not the role of the leader. They should be ensuring that people who are in that room are encouraged to be curious around optionality, choices, recommendations, and actually come up with the answer themselves, as opposed to you dictating terms on the backup and just walking out.
Yeah.
And saying that was a great meeting.
Yes. One of the things I'm always really, really curious about, though, is that, so take your organization right now, it's a transforming organization going from a kind of traditional delivery setup to more agile, iterative, and on that journey, as most businesses are right now. Now, obviously, bringing talent into that equation, and I'm talking about talent for a moment because I think it's an interesting point. You bring talent into that equation, and they've got experience somewhere along that journey, probably not having done the whole thing end to end. So if you look at the scenario we were just talking about, if you bring somebody in and they are maybe slightly behind on that journey, or they're slightly ahead, therefore their ideas aren't exactly aligned to where you're at right now. So there's a will to make things happen, but the skill is different to what you have. How do you deal with that? Is there a way of dealing with that, would you say?
Part of that is injecting a bit of agitation into the mix. So positive agitation, whether it be around, just as a current context, data expertise as an example. And you've got to give them some free space. You've got to give them the time to be informed. Back to my earlier point around being a strong leader means that you've got the data points to be able to have counter arguments and be empowered, have the conversations with, again, people who are perhaps not wanting to shift forward. So you've got the positive sides with the positive agitation, which is the skills uplift. If you, by whatever fate, inherited more people who you've got to bring on the journey and therefore lift up, whilst that's unfortunate, it's not something which is avoidable. It's knowing who they are and ensuring that they're being invested in accordingly. Because the last thing you want is for them to create an image that, I took on this role, didn't enjoy it because I wasn't supported and it wasn't what I thought it was. So again, getting clarity on those expectations, supporting them on that journey. And again, back to that flagpole, make sure everybody who joins the new organization knows where the flagpole is, because everybody else knows where it is.
Yeah.
And if people aren't on the same map, then you've got a real problem, and you won't transform culture, let alone the outcome.
I can safely say that as experience talking, because I think, the concept of it is so clear to me, but actually you go through these learning phases, right? And you recognize the importance of articulating that flagpole from the outset. You think you've articulated it sometimes, or at least at my level in my career, you think you've articulated it sometimes. And you recognize that maybe there was a little bit more that you should have done to articulate it.
Well, I think but again, back to the COVID point, but in the 4.5 years, I have been extremely consistent and repetitive on the flagpole point. Because if you don't remind people, because you're always got a consistent churn in the organization anyway, through attrition and or growth in my case, and you've got to continue to remind and set the expectation of where that is. Because ultimately, in the case of payments in the UK, everybody's moving to ISO 22 message standards. These are consistent outcomes that we all have to do. But if you leave people in the dark and they're just doing a role out of context, then it doesn't take long for them to drift.
Of course.
And that is damaging to everybody involved.
Definitely. Okay. So one thing I wanted to talk about for a moment, which is a concept that you've brought to me a few times, and again, I read it in the recent interview, is the concept of the change dragon. So can you explain to us what this is?
I had the privilege many years ago of working for an amazing CEO who was actually on the Joint Chiefs under Reagan and Bush in the UN. So this is General Charles Krulak. And one of the first, it's actually a Chinese proverb, but stories that he told me, and he was a great storyteller because of his background, was around the change dragon, which he was relayed by his equivalent in Beijing. And really the story of the change dragon is very much around when you're facing the change dragon, you've got multiple ways of dealing with it. One, you can face it on first hand, but you've got to recognize you're just a human and it's a big dragon, and dragon of change in this context. So it's just going to consume you. Or you can choose to turn your back and ignore the fact that the change dragon's even there. Free lunch for the dragon of change. So there's only one option left. And this is really about getting onto the back of the dragon of change and learning how to steer and influence it and survive as a result. It's one of those stories that's stuck with me for over 20 years since he told me that. And as I was doing a research for that particular article you were mentioning, I did come across the fact the Queen had also made a thing around her Golden Jubilee around change as the new inevitability, just like death and taxes used to be the old saying. So, change is with us constantly. It's how you govern and deal with it that is really critical.
Okay, yeah, and again, I think we've covered a lot of what that means in the context of leadership, right? It's pretty clear to me. I suppose the question I do have is, so when you look at that in the context of the CIO role, what do you see the future of the CIO role being?
It is a continual journey, and part of how I've gone into this part of my career, as opposed to just business strategy and the like, is a strong CIO has to understand not only the technology, not only the business, but also the customer and the journeys that it supports. So it feels like, okay, you're asking them to take on everything. But if you don't have that informed understanding of those different vectors, then actually you're not in a strong position to deliver the outcomes that your business relies on, your customers rely on, and to take your team members on the journey as well. Because again, back to General Krulak and where I learned the analogy, it was always around think of yourself as a customer. And if you think in the bank context in particular, quite often staff are the customers of their own outcomes. So you've really got to, as a CIO, remind everybody of that point, but also invest in your own knowledge of what's happening in the business. Don't stay in the background with your supply chain and their engineers. You've got to be at the front of the shop,
sure,
and be willing to talk on their language, their level, with what are the issues. And that may be working with regulators, and maybe working with industry groups, really just understanding where the industry is moving and or the sector that you're engaged in is moving.
Right.
And that's part of, for me, in my role, is maintaining a diversity of inputs, whether that be the full-time role plus different board seats and so on, just to continue to have different opinions, different observations, which actually all support the work you do on a day-to-day basis.
If you look at that set of responsibilities that you now have, obviously big roles in their own right, some full-time, some advisory. How do you balance all of that?
You got to have a discipline of saying no, because too often you can be asked, can you just join one more advisory board or another board? And there is a capacity point on where you just need to level set. The way I've always looked at it is how they complement each other. So I've been quite lucky, I guess, is the way of putting it, around being able to select what makes sense. So getting that balance of stuff that's charitable, the stuff that's industry, the stuff that's actually just interesting for me as an input for my payments role. So, but from a time management standpoint, you do have to be incredibly disciplined, but recognize that it is about what you're investing in yourself to then create the outcomes on the other side.
And do you put meticulous level of detail into or time into planning your diary in advance, or do you have support with that? How does that actually work?
Yeah, and I think as part of senior leadership is, I don't think any of us could really be successful without our support teams, whether it be our PAs or business managers and so on. They are critical to us being able to do our roles. Because again, it's about having that other avenue to provide information to you in real time as you need it, versus having to scour around for the information yourself. And that's no different to, particularly when you receive board papers, you need to set aside time to read them. And, one board I sit on is a tremendous volume of work to go through. You also put that into the context of the accountability of that particular role. So you've got to invest it, and you reap what you sow, as they say.
Of course, and you can then leverage that knowledge elsewhere in other roles. Okay, cool. And wanted to explore one example of the work that you've been doing with NatWest as well. So I read recently about the point that in your first year you had reduced issues within technology and increased stability by 80%. And I think there's a quote, actually, I've got it right here, that says, this is your quote. So it goes back to changing the culture and the mindset of an organization from being a change organization to one that understood its accountability for the run side as well, ensuring that we're stable before we start changing. Simple concept. Sounds very easy, right? But actually, we all know that is not an easy thing to do. So how do you do that? How do you achieve that?
And again, it really comes back to driving the focus, because an organization and the current team is not the only one, can be very good at getting themselves out of an incident and returning service, etc. But do we really want to be doing that all the time? Do the team members actually want to be fixing problems as opposed to developing and delivering new solutions? So part of that whole culture shift, if you like, was just reminding people of your accountability is bigger than what may be your remit of the role. So being able to talk to the change side of the organization and say, let's be conscious of the change that you're delivering on where it ends up. And if it becomes an incident, it's either going to go into operations teams or it's going to go into an incident recovery room. And all that creates additional work and unnecessary stress. So if you bring that back and give people that context and visibility, and that they are accountable for the run side, meaning the day-to-day operation of the business, then there's going to be greater sensitivity to ensuring that the quality of that change is not going to disrupt the stability of the operation. Now that, as you say, sounds simple. The execution isn't something that happens in a week, and it took a year. Again, remaining consistent in the message, highlighting, if you don't measure it, you don't see the shift. So it's highlighting those measures and actually displaying that to the team as well, saying, this is the positive work you're doing. So and again, back to my analogies and my storytelling, baling hay at the back of on the farm, you're driving the tractor along and behind you are bales of hay dropping out onto the field. That you see the fruits of your labor, and that is no different in a banking context, in a technology context, because everything we do is a bale of hay of some sort.
Of course.
And so give people that satisfaction.
And then I guess at some point there's a meticulous level of detailed focus around what individuals are doing, maybe not for you, but I guess somewhere in the organization.
So, well, it depends on the situation. Sometimes you do have to lean in yourself. But it is, and again, with payments, you touch the entire organization. So be it channels, be it operation centers, etc. So there's another layer to this from a complexity standpoint of stakeholder management and engagement. And as an industry, payments is a network. So, one part of the network be having issues, which then impacts you, and vice versa. So the web gets more complex as you weave it out. But at the same time, it's how you're engaging with all those stakeholders and being prepared to hold people to account if they've slipped up, be that internally or externally.
Right. Very good. Well, look, that's been really enlightening. Thanks for taking us through that. The one last question that I have for you, which we always finish on, is: so what do you know now at this stage of your career that you wish you knew right at the start?
It's a jolly good question. I could be slightly facetious and say that how much travel I would have ended up doing, and how many international moves. But I think the key thing is the storytelling, to be fair, and how powerful it really is. And, part of my early career was in the consulting space. And whilst that wasn't necessarily storytelling in and of itself, but you were there to inform others and to give them that sort of counsel on ways forward. So I would put it down to recognizing the sheer power of storytelling. Analogies, if that's simpler for people. to lead an organization and to bring people with you, and to Barbara Kellerman's famous book, to have followership.
Simple.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.